Just to let this concept settle in a little bit, I'll give you a second example of how we can link processes to user stories and use that as a prototyping process to make sure we're building something valuable. Here's another hypothetical discussion between our project lead implementing a CRM at United Children's Theater and the executive director. And they find out that there's this process that's pretty ad hoc now where they always want to make sure they recognize donations, that they send a thank you note to donors. So they talk about this and they come up with this process here. The donation gets recorded. There are some things that they need to be able to deal with if the donor doesn't have a valid email address. And if it is over $200, another key thing here is that we want to have a task for the executive director to also send a personal note. Now, here's a great example of where you can score wins with these things on enterprise software when we're thoughtful and we really think about these donors as a persona and problem scenarios that they have. They use this process and they come up with the idea that, hey, our donors, especially the smaller ones, probably forget to write off their donation on their taxes. If we could use the system to send an automatic email to all of them on January 20th with a revised or a current receipt for their taxes, that might be something that they would really appreciate and that we could relatively easily add to the automation here as we do the CRM. So let's look at a couple of key user stories around this. But before we do that, let's look at the metrics, because that's another thing we want to practice. Number of recognitions sent would be our raw process metric here. Undelivered recognitions, people that didn't get recognized, would be our output metric, so a flaw in the process. And an outcome would be maybe the net change in our ability to get more repeat donors. That would be an outcome that would mean that this is really making a difference. We're looking to spend more time on person-to-person donor development, reduce time running around, especially now that they have a development manager and an executive director on, did we send this person a thank you and so forth. And they want to spend less time on trying to find somebody's email address to email them, waiting, trying to find the executive director to write a thank you note, miscommunication, stuff like that. So how would we attach a user story to this? Here is an epic around specifically the process of the executive director sending a personalized response. And a child story for this might be something like, as the donor manager, I want to quickly understand the donor and their contribution so that they can appropriately follow up without a lot of extra work and make sure that they get this personal recognition. So you see some test cases over here and a few things that they think are important for the executive director to have visible to them. So for instance, is the donor a parent or parent of alumni? Because that makes it easier for the executive director to write her note in a thoughtful way. And they make a note, the Salesforce people, the CRM team, hey, maybe we could look at some past letters if they're around that the executive director wrote, so we could make up a template here that is thoughtful and in line with what they're actually doing. Here is a note about how they want to make sure that they record this, so when somebody follows up with one of these donors, they know that they don't have to worry that they failed to recognize this donor's donation and maybe didn't make them feel very good. So if it was a written note, make sure there's a way to see that and attach it to the donor record so that they can keep an eye on this. And if it is an email because it was a smaller donation, make sure it's logged and visible so that they can see that. And there's a few other user stories here, but this is a pretty good sampling of how we would relate user stories back to the process that we described earlier. In the next video, we'll look at how we attach validation criteria to these user stories and these processes so that we integrate testing and observation and making sure that we're iterating to something valuable into the regular cadence of our IT project.